with you. Dear friends, what makes a good United Nations climate change conference? Yeah, the question is always difficult, and this is the question all the organizers have to answer to each time a COP has to be dealt with. The answer is usually difficult because a conference of the parties is a multilateral event involving more than 195 or 96 countries with different levels of economic development, different treatment of nature resources, different political context, histories, cultures, background. And those parties need to deliver on a consensual basis on issues where their interests are not necessarily the same. This is the reason why the negotiations were lasting 21 years before reaching the Paris Agreement. This is simply to say that a COP is a complex event with multi-dimensional aspects. Political and strategical one, the host needs to set the vision, the objectives in terms of momentum and high political decisions and pledges. Diplomatic, the host has to manage the different sensibilities and the interest and impulse the consensus. Technical, the host has to succeed in advancing the UNFCCC agenda and the different process of the negotiations and to deliver on the objectives which are set for the COP, because each COP has its own agenda. Organizational, a COP is receiving thousands and thousands of people per day during 10 days. You can imagine the hard organization this requires to welcome everybody in a good condition and to maintain the safety and the security of all. And you know that during the COP, the host is receiving head of state, prime ministers, all people are there. So there is an issue of security also. So the host has a huge responsibility to anticipate and to prepare each aspect very carefully to maximize the chances of a perfect infrastructure to welcome the participant, to hold good negotiations, and to deliver on the objectives which are set for the conference. It's why in the process of the COPs, there are many and several formal and informal meetings which are held throughout the year in the run-up to the COP. A COP is also an extraordinary platform for the hosts. They can use the COP to promote their countries, their achievements and their ambitions, as well as their challenges. Now, I will maybe ask the question, what are the exact ingredients that will make COP26 a success story? From my past and current experience as a climate champion, this is what I have learned in the basis to organize a successful COP. First, the COP should be an action-oriented COP. And Robert said it for urgency reasons, and I will come back to this point. Second, the COP should be an inclusive COP, which will involve every group of society and deliver solutions for everyone. But the most important for COP26 is that it's a COP which is focused on shifting the paradigm. Let us recall that COP26 is happening in a very special time of our common history. Never before have humans from all over the world faced the same crisis at the same time and with the same economic, social, and health-related collapses. COP26 is also happening in a time where the priorities for many countries are not fighting climate change, but surviving the health and economic crisis. Unfortunately or fortunately, and I'm very sorry for what is happening now in Germany and Belgium and this morning in China, the recent tragedy of the floods in Belgium and Germany and today in China, and I would like to seize this opportunity to express my deep condolences to all those nations. Unfortunately or fortunately, this tragedy is bringing back the urgency on the table over and over again. Because since the Paris Agreement was adopted, the CO2 emissions are in a constant increase instead of decreasing. The world is currently lagging far behind in the fight to prevent global warming rising to 1.5 degrees C. The target announced in Paris would result in warming well above 3 degrees C by 2100 compared to the pre-industrial levels. So we are not doing well. And if we continue as we are, temperature will carry on rising, bringing even more catastrophic flooding, bushfires, extreme weather, and destruction of species and the Earth's biodiversity. So the world needs to halve the emissions over the next decade and reach net zero carbon emission by the middle of the century if we are to limit global temperature rises to 1.5 degrees C. It's why it is especially important that UK take the leadership and the developed countries and the largest emitters take the lead if we seriously want to achieve the green transition. So what do we need to shift to a green transition? First, we need international political will. Government can do a lot just by sending a clear and credible signal of their commitment to transform the economy to green economy and the finance to green finance. This will be transformational and will impulse green investment and innovation, fueling trust among investors on their seriousness and intent in combating the climate crisis. Second, parties should commit to implement more coherent policies, especially related to coal and fossil fuel subsidies. Governments cannot call for green transition while still allowing the construction of coal industries and giving subsidies to fossil fuel sector. Yet around 55 to 90 billion US dollar per year are devoted to supporting fossil fuel in the developed country, and in the developing country it's something around 548 billion US dollar, which is spent to support fossil fuel consumers. So effective climate actions means that government policies and regulation should move in the same direction. The interaction of policy and regulation signals across a much broader range of areas will determine how fast we can make the low carbon transition a reality. So in COP26, there is a huge challenge for the parties. The parties will need to deliver on a robust proposal for carbon pricing and carbon market globally, and this is the famous Article 6, which was unsuccessfully dealt with in COP25. We need also to provide incentives to introduce innovation. Until now, we have difficulties to fund innovation. Societies have never managed to decouple economic growth from emissions at this scale in the past. A concept of absolute decoupling was not even imaginable. But if policies are setting expectations and providing incentives to introduce innovation, we can maybe overcome our limits and the limits of our imagination. We need to respect the commitments, and this is a very important point in terms of finance, supporting the developing country. The promises made in Paris was to support by $100 billion each year since 2020 the developing world to tackle climate change. This was postponed to 2025 because of the COVID. And I personally think that the COVID should not be an excuse, because the COVID will not stop climate change. And this financial commitment should be respected, because the developing country and especially the Africans and the small islands are tackling climate change on daily basis. Second, developed countries should respect their commitment in terms of increasing their ambitions. Countries are expected to update their 2030 target before Glasgow meeting through their NDCs, and be in line with holding temperature rise to 1.5 degrees C. Until now, the NDCs are not fulfilling these objectives. Till now, the NDCs, coupled with the RACHEP mechanism, which are the backbone of the Paris Agreement, have shown their limit. The level of the political will and the perseverance of the states is very weak. We need more ambitions. Last point, we need to act together. And this is the most, I will say, the most important point, and this is not something we are discussing within the COP. This is something the leaders of this world should understand. You know, a fundamental property of green gas emission is that their location is irrelevant. Climate change has no border, no nationalities, no land. Wherever it is emitted, a ton of CO2 has, from a climate change perspective, exactly the same impact everywhere in the world. A measure to avoid the emission of 1 ton of CO2 thus has exactly the same impact on the climate, whether adopted by the EU or the Knesset or the US Congress. The political choices of a country located at the other end of the planet have no less impact on the increase in temperature or the increase in the frequency of natural disasters affecting the national territory than national political choices. So borders are inexistent. No country can protect itself against climate change. No deglobalization can protect a country against the effect of climate change. The indirect effects of climate change are threat to multipliers that will exacerbate stressors abroad, such as poverty, environmental degradation, political instability, and social tensions, conditions that can foster terrorist activities and other forms of violence, and maybe be at the root of waves and waves of migration. The IPCC is talking about 250 million migrants in 2050 if we don't act now. That's the question of climate change, is therefore the first genuine question with a robust international dimension, which needs a geopolitical approach to tackle together the climate crisis. That's why within Liberal International, I have created the first ever Climate Justice Committee, recognizing that tackling climate change cannot be done in isolation. We must mainstream it across everything, all the policies, all the program, the foreign policy we are doing and we have been doing so far. This is our attempt to contribute to the puzzle, to build and to participate in building the green transition. I will end by saying that a good COP is not enough to save humanity. We need to change our mindset, our culture, our model of development to win the challenges of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear Hakima. And now, Ed, follow that.
Well, thank you. could link their climate science knowledge and expertise with being a politician as well. There aren't that many of them. So Hakima, thank you for what you've done in COPs, not just the one in Morocco, which was successful, but before and since. So how do you organize a successful COP? Well, the first thing you've got to realize is how difficult COPs are. As Hakima said, you've got 195, 196 countries. You've got a huge amount of vested interests, and you're trying to bring them together with consensus. When we are essentially with the global transition, which is so crucial, we're trying to change 200 plus years of development history in the world in a relatively short period of maybe 30, 40 years. I mean, it's a massive task and it's extremely difficult. It's also very slow. I represented the UK at 3 COPs at Warsaw, Doha, and Lima, and I think Hakima was at least 2 of those. I gate crashed Paris in 2015, which I can talk about some other time, possibly. But I felt at those, both the preparation for them and looking at what happened after them, how difficult it was, how slow it was. And to give you an indication from the front line, if you like, I remember the Lima COP. We were in this sort of aircraft hangar type room, huge numbers of people. And we were negotiating as the final stage of weeks of negotiation. We were negotiating for about 36 hours non-stop. And you literally didn't go back to your hotel room. You had the same shirt on, et cetera, et cetera. It was hot. People were deliberately playing long, so people had to cancel their flights home, and the negotiations went beyond the scheduled time. And it all ended. The key moment of this long negotiation was basically in a rugby scrum at the front of this aircraft hangar, where you had the Chinese negotiator, the US negotiator, the UNFCCC, and 1 or 2, I think the European negotiator was there. And then gradually, in concentric circles around this sort of type of UN scrum, you had the whole world. And the negotiation was around that Lima COP, these nationally determined contributions. At the time, they were called intended national determined contributions, and you get a sense from that word that was added then, intended, that there was a real compromise going on. We had gone to the COP, both as the UK and Europe, wanting to have legally binding targets adopted by each country. Became very clear that the Chinese, the Americans, and others were not going to have legally binding constraints as we'd adopted within the European Union, because they regarded it as an infringement of their sovereignty. And so we were dancing around for days effectively about what the actual phrase would be. And it turned out at the end of this scrum to be intended nationally determined contributions. Now we call them NDCs. That just shows you how painful this process can be, because having decided what the words were in 2014, we then decided what they might be, that we'd actually have these things in Paris in 2015. And then we determined that people would have to come forward with them in 2020. And it's such a painful process. But nevertheless, it is absolutely critical. These COPs, I think, are on one level humanity at its worst, and another level humanity at its best. I actually think the Paris agreement in 2015 was the most significant international agreement in human history. Quite extraordinary that we got 195, 96 countries to agree to what they did in Paris, albeit imperfect. And it was critical for sending a signal that the world was taking this issue seriously. For once, it was the first major climate agreement far beyond the Kyoto Protocol back in 1990. And although clearly there's huge amounts more to do, it was a landmark in this global fight against this challenge. And if I step back from Paris and I look to Glasgow and I try and think through what are the factors that determine whether a COP is going to be successful, I would point to 5, with a 6th coming as a secret 6th at the end of my talk. The 5 that I point to is, first of all, coalition building. The second is political leadership. The third is technology and whether there's been any breakthroughs in technology, and particularly economics of technology. The fourth is money, and the fifth is luck. And the sixth, I'll tell you in a minute. The first one, and I wanted to use these parameters of what makes a successful COP in terms of what worked at Paris and how that might play in Glasgow. So in Paris, when it came to coalition building, a huge amount of preparations had happened, just as Hakima was talking about in those various meetings that happened in the year up to any COP. But actually, Paris was not just 1 year of work. All the work from Copenhagen in 2010 had been about Paris. The COPs that I went to in Warsaw, Doha, and Lima were all leading up to Paris. It was a long preparation. But over and beyond that, there was the host nation, Paris. And I have to pay huge tribute to Laurent Fabius, who was the president of the COP then. Appointed by President François Hollande. Hollande was not having a great time as president, and he saw the COP as a way of rejuvenating his record as president in the Élysée. And he brought in, one of the most, I think, effective French politicians of his generation, Laurent Fabius. And I think he did a great job. I have to say that contrast, and this may seem mean, it's not meant mean, it's meant more factually, contrasting Laurent Fabius's international standing and standing in France with that of Alok Sharma. Now, Alok Sharma is a good guy. I've nothing against him, but he just doesn't have the standing. He doesn't have the political heft that a Fabius had. And that is a real shame for Glasgow and a real problem. And even though Hollande wasn't a great figure for the president of France, I think Johnson is less of a figure in the world. So the preparations that Fabius did were important, but equally the preparations that the UK did within the EU were important. I had 3 years of climate diplomacy at the EU, negotiating the EU Heads of State Agreement, which was published in October 2014, which was way more ambitious than the Conservatives wanted here in the UK, or that many countries wanted in the EU. But we set up something called the Green Growth Group. We got people together, and the EU went much further than anyone had expected in 2014. And a month after the EU in October 2014 had made that preparatory statement, there was a joint statement from China and the US going further than they had expected. And that was all the preparations for Paris, as people worked in different parts of the world to get people to come together for ambition. The other bit of critical coalition building for Paris and why Paris worked was in the White House with President Obama. Paris would not have happened but for Barack Obama. He put one of the most talented Democrat officials on this game, a guy called John Podesta. John Podesta was the chief of staff for Clinton at the White House during Clinton, I think his second term. Now, I've met Podesta a few times. He's quite a small guy. He absolutely reeks power. This is a guy who is powerful, knows how to use it, and used it for the benefit of the climate under Obama. Great appointment by Obama. So the point I'm trying to make, there was a huge amount of work done by a number of people over time to make sure we got to Paris in the right state. And I contrast that with the preparations for Glasgow. Not just about Alex Sharma. Brexit was not a good preparation for Glasgow. Previously we were at the table with the Germans, the French, the Spanish, the Polish, and so on, and able to push ambition because we were ambitious. Moving away from that table and being host of the COP has meant we've not been able to push the Europeans further and faster. Now, some in Europe want to go fast, but the Polish and the Hungarians, they're brakes. But we managed to overcome that. Our absence for the table has reduced European ambition and organization. And then the catastrophic cut in the British aid budget, absolutely catastrophic. Catastrophic in and of itself for what it's doing for global Britain, but also for poverty. People are going to die because of that decision. But over and above that appalling issue of not tackling poverty around the world. It's massively reduced our political heft in the preparations ahead of Glasgow. When you go to one of these negotiations, you know that the developing countries, who often organize in a group called the G77, you have to get their agreement. It's their world too. There's more of them than us. So as liberal internationals, we need to understand what it means in the poorest worlds and how climate change is hitting them. And their voice is critical. It should be an equal voice. And to tell them ahead of that, the host nation to tell them ahead of that, that by the way, those aid budgets that have been promised, that have been expected, that have been pledged or being cut, it's been an absolute disaster. And over and above that, there's climate diplomacy that goes through the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Let me tell you two of my heroes. You'll be really surprised at this. David Miliband and William Hague. When they were foreign secretaries, they ensured that climate diplomacy was well funded. And our voice, the British voice, in places like Beijing and Washington, which is so crucial, were really well heard. Johnson, and indeed May before him, absolutely trashed climate diplomacy. So our preparations have been poor as the host nation. There are some, I'm about to come on to them, prevailing pressures which give me more an optimistic point of view. But as a country, our government is letting us down and letting the world down through a whole series of actions, which frankly, it should be ashamed of. But over and above coalition building, it's about political leadership. And ahead of Paris, we had that political leadership. We had it in Obama. We had it in President Xi of China. Because at that stage, Xi was really outward looking. He was looking to make a place and a splash in the world in a slightly different way than he seems to want to do now. And that was really effective. And his main climate negotiator, Xi Jinping, had that political backing so he could go further. He played his cards very carefully, the Chinese always do, but he had that political backing from the top. And then there's Narendra Modi. Narendra Modi was relatively new at that stage as Prime Minister of India. He wrote an incredible book when he was the Chief Minister of the Gujarat, when he actually created a climate change ministry in the Gujarat. He wrote a book relating his desire to clean up the environment, do environment action to his spiritual principles. And he was incredibly outward looking. So whatever one thinks about Narendra Modi, and maybe we shouldn't talk about too many of his policies tonight, but on this, he showed real leadership. And that was crucial to the success of Paris in 2015. Now, where's political leadership in the world today? Well, Trump has gone. That's a good thing, right? And Joe Biden has come in, and that's a good thing. No doubt about that. And Biden has put forward Kerry, and that's great. But the US-China relations are far worse than they were in 2015. The tension is real, whether it's Republican or Democrat, and the Chinese feel it. And it's one of the reasons, and we can talk as internationals about the Uyghurs in Hong Kong, of course we should and must. But in that crucial US-China relationship, we've seen some real aggressive positioning by both sides. And Beijing is responding as you might have expected. However, and this is some good news, I think the Chinese do see global action on climate change as in their interests. It's embedded in their 5-year plans. It has been now for 2 5-year plans. And therefore, maybe we can get over that US-China relationship. Modi, I think he's much more on the defensive than he was in 2015. I'm not really on top of where the Indians are ahead of Glasgow. But overall, the political landscape doesn't look as good as it was running up to Paris. I hope I'm wrong, but it doesn't, certainly from my perspective now out of office, looking in, it doesn't feel as good. Third reason why Paris was more successful than we had expected was technology breakthrough. The price of solar in particular, but also the price of wind, was plummeting. Some energy ministers have particularly good policies. I'm not going to say what particular one, but most importantly, a sort of unanticipated or unplanned alliance between German subsidies for solar and Chinese manufacturing opportunity had driven down the price of solar, continues to drive down the price of solar. And in 2015, it began to look like this transition wasn't going to be so expensive after all. And people thought, hey, you know what? We may well be able to do that. Now, I don't think there's been quite such a big technological breakthrough ahead of Glasgow. However, the good news is that solar and wind costs have continued to fall. The costs of other key technologies, particularly batteries, they have continued to fall further and faster than anyone had expected, even in Paris. And there is a lot of money, private and public, going into technology. So again, I'm not sure if the negotiators feel it in the way they did in Paris, but nevertheless, I think there's a good technology economic story going into Glasgow. Fourth issue, coalition building, political leadership, technology breakthrough, money. You'll be surprised at that. Money is an issue. Hakima quite rightly talked about the £100 billion per annum that was pledged by 2020, which has been delayed. This is a critical part of the negotiations. The developing countries who haven't put the stuff up there, let's remember, and are feeling some of the horrible impacts of climate change already on their crops, on flooding, on their own biodiversity, and so on. Not reasonably, they would like some support in their climate change mitigation and development, as well as the cost of adapting their lives and countries to climate change. And the $100 billion per annum from the developed countries was I think, a reasonable deal. The problem is it's not been implemented. So it worked in Paris. People said, oh, well, at least you're signing up to it. But as we come to Glasgow, people are still saying, where's the money? You've not delivered it. The multilateral development banks, the money never leaves out the door. And there may be some reasons for that. But I think the Glasgow debate will all be about whether that money can be delivered, is being delivering, because understandably, people are skeptical. There is another element to the money debate, though, in Glasgow, which I'm more optimistic about, something that I've done quite a lot of thinking about, and that is private finance. How do we get capitalism to change its way so that private investment flows in dramatic amounts into climate change technology and the climate change action? And there's a guy called Mark Carney. You might have heard him. He's Canadian. He was the former bank of the Bank of England. In the one good thing that Boris Johnson has done, he appointed Mark Carney to be the advisor on climate finance for the COP. And there is a really rich agenda there. And it may not be attractive to many other teams. We will see. They still want the public money, the $100 billion to be delivered. But I think there is a chance, linking to what Hakima said about the carbon market, that if there's good private finance initiatives, that could help make the COP successful. Final factor of what makes a successful COP, before I come to my reveal at the end of what really makes it, is luck. I don't know if you've been involved in negotiations. I think good negotiations always have a bit of luck. And in Paris, I think the luck was the world had recovered from the financial crash of 2007-8. People were more confident. In Copenhagen in 2010, they didn't have any confidence at all. They were feeling the pain of the financial crash. But 2015 was just at that moment, that sort of Goldilocks moment of the global economy, that made people more confident. Are we that in the moment? Well, we're in the middle of the worst health crisis the world has seen for a century or more. I worry that means some governments will be saying we've got to grow at all costs. We can't afford any of these climate change transition policies. Equally, there may be others who say this is the moment. This is the moment to grasp. We need a green recovery, a climate-friendly recovery. And maybe from all the impacts we're seeing in the new science, Hakima quite rightly talked about the appalling floods in Germany and Belgium, what we saw on the Chinese and the underground, which is quite so shocking it was in Jeonju, I think it was. That may well be a stimulus, and that may be the thing that gets people over the side. Only we will find out the end of December. So coalition building, political leadership, technology breakthrough, money and luck. What's the final thing? What's this secret? Really simple. It's China, right? Unless China signs up, doesn't matter. That's why, going back to Prescott, actually, you don't normally hear me praising John Prescott. This country has identified China as the key player in climate. It's responsible for most of the emissions. It's still growing. It's still investing in coal. If you don't get China into the right place in Glasgow, you haven't got it. You haven't got a successful COP. Kerry is trying to use his huge political skills to bring that into the right place. Let's hope he's right. He's successful. My worry is that Johnson and Dominic Raab are in exactly the wrong place to do that negotiation with the Chinese. I hope I'm wrong, but if I'm right, then it's going to be tough to get a good COP in Glasgow.
Thank you, Ed. You've heard two powerful presentations from people who really know what they're talking about, and which I think we're a bit worried whether the government does know what it's talking about in that area. And let's take some questions. We've had some sent to us in advance. One is more of a philosophical question from Alessandra Rossetti, who's a Liberal Democrat councillor in Haringey. And it says that as liberals, we don't like to mandate or enforce targets and best practices, but with respect to the climate, we're in a now or never situation. How do we resolve the two? And Hakima, maybe you could give your views. We discussed it earlier this afternoon.
Yeah, Alexandra is right, but as liberals, we are standing for some set of values, and those values are not are interdependent and not divisible. So you can't be in a position where you are representing a danger for the others and be backed by liberals. So we are in a situation of negotiating and acting and deciding for whom will survive and whom will die. So it's a question of urgency, it's a question of life. And as liberals, we have the responsibility to make aware our parties about the situation and to make aware about our parties to change their policies and to change to implement the global transformation the Paris Agreement is calling for. And I'm coming back to what I said before. We can do that unless we have international coherency, but we need to. It's not a question of being enforcing anything or targeting anything, but the question is a question of survival. I remember the head of state of Tuvalu, who used to say, and I'm sure David will remember this man, the chief of state of Tuvalu, who used to say, you save Tuvalu, you save the world. If we save the most vulnerable, we will save the world. So together we need to do that. And I explained how it's important that we do it together. So liberals and no liberals, this is a question of life.
Thank you, Hakima. Do you want to comment? Ed?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with what Hakima said. I think our values for the future generations of the world demand action. And I want to just take a little bit, if I may, a little bit of disagreement with the questioner, Alessandra, because the implicit in what she said is that liberals don't ever believe in regulations. I'm maybe putting words into your mouth, Alessandra, so I apologize if I am. But I think we do. I have no problem with the regulations. I think you have to be a right-wing neoclassical liberal, sort of laissez-faire, devil take the hindmost Tory to believe that regulations are always wrong. And I know this from my time in government. I was trying to get through, and we did eventually get through, minimum energy efficiency regulations to require landlords to make their houses energy efficient. And if they didn't meet this certain standard, they wouldn't be allowed to let them out. And the idea was it would tackle fuel poverty, it would reduce carbon emissions because the homes would be better insulated, and it would create jobs. So it was a real win-win. It was very positive. However, it was a regulation. And my main oppo in the coalition was a guy called, for his name now, Eric Pickles. And Eric Pickles didn't like regulations. And he said to me, Ed, me old chum, because he was from Yorkshire, he said, Ed, me old chum, regulations are communist. Regulations are communist. And he was trying to stop me, put this regulation forward. And I said, Eric, thou shalt not kill is a regulation. And it came in before Karl Marx. And my point was that regulations that are appropriate, that have good values behind them, just as Hakima said, those regulations are the ones we need. And if there are regulations to shape the market, shape society, so that it's preventing this catastrophe facing our world, then I'm well up for regulations. And I actually think regulations are quite critical in the way we will shape financial markets, building buildings in the future, and so on. And so let's not be afraid as liberals of passing laws and regulations.
If you allow me, I want to add something. We should not be naive, you know. The Paris Agreement is not a binding agreement. And there are so many lobby and so many interests all over the world. People, the countries producing fossil fuel and oil will not be interested at all by the carbon pricing or anything, any decision under the COP process. What we qualified will be the success of COP26 is not interesting, is not at any interest for such kind of countries. So if parties and countries on their own didn't make regulation, didn't regulate the market, never will be able to reach the transition.
That's really, yeah. The next question, I'll give you Ed on this one first. It comes from Joe Ingram, who chairs Green Tech Labs in Italy. I'm not sure if you've come across him before. He is most impressive, a lot of writings. We are effectively at war with global warming. How can we best help governments to develop the political will to shift direct and indirect subsidies from the fossil fuel industries to the aerospace industry to pursue R&D into green technologies that take CO2 and methane out of the atmosphere, as well as clean aircraft engines?
Well, Joe is exactly right about what needs to happen. We need to see those shifts away from fossil fuel subsidies and into green tech. And he particularly singles out carbon capture technologies and green flight. They are two of my favorite technologies. And I think we absolutely need to support them. When Liberal Democrats were in government in the UK, we were developing carbon capture storage products as well projects, as well as carbon capture usage and storage projects to take out these greenhouse gases. In some areas we were early stages, in others we were more advanced. So we had the world's only gas powered CCS project. When we left government, George Osborne cancelled those projects. And so from world leaders, we're now to world followers, and critical projects in technologies that can save the world, the Tories cancelled. Sorry, I haven't finished, but I want to get over to this UK audience. Don't ever allow the Tories to say they've acted on climate change. They have been barriers every step of the way. They should hang their heads in shame on that. The other issue is clean aircraft. I think we should be the champions of clean aircraft. You know, Britain has an amazing aerospace industry. It's under the cosh at the moment. This is a case for really subsidizing it and helping it to make the transition. So the Rolls-Royces of this world build the best zero carbon engines for aircraft in the world. And that would create jobs. It would also mean we can say to people, we have nothing against people flying around the world. I have nothing against people flying the world. I have something against people polluting the world. And if you can fly around the world and not pollute it, then let's do it.
Hakima?
I think that we need first to be a little bit strategic, or to have the vision. First, we need to have a two levels approach, a bottom up approach. And here, if we want to succeed, we need to foster the change beyond 7 billion of people. And the question is the question of choice of consumption. And we can change the mindset of people in their choices, daily choices, in choosing the technology which is clean technology, green technology, etc. And we can also, under the process of the COP, switch from this global approach, which is the national determinant indice and the aggregation of the indices, to a local determinant contribution, which will foster the change within the territory, on the land, with the question of proximity. That in territory you have a reservoir of research and development. You have universities. You have business. You have people who can act on a daily basis and change the way of consumption, the way of productions, etc. The second level is more a top-down approach. And I said that we have to lay the foundation for a geopolitical approach to the climate crisis. I agree with Lord Dave. It's good to have to promote innovation, but we should not forget that the budget for research and development all over the world is very low. If you take the budget of research and development in Europe or even in United States, it's by far lower than the one in China. China is producing 2,000 brevet patents per year, while France, for example, is producing 200 patents per year. So I think that we should have a strategy, a long-term strategy and a vision to increase the budget for research and development. And for all the sectors, the global transformation is not only energy oriented, but it's building, it's land, it's forestry, it's transport. And by the way, UK is working now on the Marrakesh Partnership, which is a platform gathering all together the non-state actor, the business, the bankers, and the state to set the rules and the foundation for policies which will support the business and the private sector and the inventors to implement their innovation. So we need that the climate issue must be open to be disseminated to all bodies of multilateralism, reinvesting all bodies of multilateralism, linking their normative power, uniting affinity countries around an ambitious program of innovation. And I think that I myself was dealing with an initiative of 1,000 with Picard, the inventor of the solar plane. We launched together an initiative of 1,000 innovation during COP22. The problem is all those innovations are facing a problem of funding because banks until now are not trusting in new in new technology. So if you want to have the fund, you should prove that your technology is working and is reliable and is scalable, etc., etc. So I think that we can support government, and personally within Liberal International, and this is what we are doing within the Climate Justice Committee. We are trying to support the parties to build policies to allow them to reach the global transformation in all the sectors. Dave was speaking about the cost of the energy, renewable energy, and Dave, you are right. And we used to say during COP22 in Morocco that this is climate change and not climate change, because climate change has brought to my country the opportunity to build the biggest solar power installation in the world, to create millions of jobs, etc., etc. And indeed, it's the same in the United States, for example. They have created millions of jobs in renewable. But the problem, if we don't have this international coherency concerning the subsidies of fossil fuel, you are creating a business in an environment which is which is not competitive. So I think that this COP26 is very important. If COP26 succeed in delivering on a carbon mechanism, that will support a lot, and that will foster innovation, and that will foster the transition.
You're nodding. Do you want to say? Ed, you're nodding. Do you want to say something?
No,
it's fine. Great. Thank you, Hakima. The next question, somebody's pushing at an open door here. How important is it to include biodiversity and social equality in measures to combat climate change? Would you like to go first, Ed? You both mentioned biodiversity.
Oh, well, I mean, biodiversity and social justice must be critical to the whole movement. I don't think we should separate them at all. That's important both in terms of, let me take justice for the moment, in terms of global justice. So the poorest in the world benefit the most, as well as in our own country. I mean, I'm quite excited by the potential with solar power, because the poorest in our world don't have electricity. They don't have access to electricity. The poorest by a long way. I don't know what the figure is. Hakima may know, but it's probably about 1 billion people. And fossil fuels have never brought them electricity. We need to make sure that the transition brings electricity to those poorest billion in rural Africa and rural India, mainly rural electrification. And the great thing is the climate change friendly electricity can, because you don't need the grid lines. You have micro solar grids. You can have a local wind farm. You don't need the pylons to ship it from the big power station. So renewables give you the chance to bring electrification to the poorest in our world in a way which is climate friendly. So if we do that, I think that's quite a vision for us to pursue. At the moment, however, there's lots of vested interests in lots of countries getting in the way of spreading solar lights or solar farms. Like in any other place, the distributors of fossil fuels don't like the fact that they've now got a competitor. So that's about local politics in those countries to challenge those vested interests. But there is that opportunity. Again, on the social justice side, I mean, in our country, attacking fuel poverty is one of the best ways of also tackling the climate challenge, by ensuring that people who are currently living in really poor buildings get proper sustainable buildings that are energy efficient. My wife is a councillor in Kingston in a ward called Norbiton, which is our most socially deprived ward, and she's sort of leading the regeneration of a housing estate there. And at the moment, the homes there are just so energy inefficient and waste huge amount of energy. They're damp, they can be cold. and obviously they're gas heated. The vision and the plan is that these new homes will be in a super energy efficient, and the people's energy bills are going to tumble, and the heating is going to come from the local sewage works, or as we call it, poo to power. This will deliver clean, cheap energy for the most socially deprived community in my constituency. So, you can make this transition with social justice. I could say it's more on biodiversity, but I think I should pass it to Hakima. But the answer to Peter's question on should biodiversity be part of climate change is the answer is yes.
Hakima.
Yeah, thank you. But I will come back to the point of social justice, because this is very close to my heart. I have created the Climate Justice Committee for this reason, and I was speaking about the respect of the commitment for the same reason. If I'm speaking about respecting the commitment financially by the parties and increasing the ambitions, it's for social justice. That this is what I said, a ton of carbon which is emitted in UK is threatening the life of someone who is living in South Africa or in Nigeria. So I'm coming from this continent, which is very rich in fact, but where live people who are very poor. And as you said, Dave, you're right. We are speaking about more than 300 million people who have no access to drinking water. We are speaking about 700 million people or 600 million people who have no access to electricity, no access to energy. So you can imagine that you can't have access to healthcare, you can't have we are in fact speaking in Africa about 75% of building and infrastructure which is not existing yet. And why I'm saying that, because I want to give you my vision for how I see the carbon neutrality to be reached. In fact, Africa will count more than 2 billion people in 2050, and it will be the most dense continent in the world by 2050. The biggest market in the world, with 80% of the families who are in the middle class family. So it's a huge market will be developed in Africa. A huge opportunity to build low carbon technologies and to implement the low carbon transformation in Africa. Africa is also a reservoir of renewable energy. And if we want to reach the neutrality, we should invest in renewable in Africa. It's I don't believe that one day we will phase out fossil fuel. We will have the transition, and we will have to cohabitate for many years again with fossil fuel. But if we want to decrease the footprint and the impact of the developed and industrial countries all over the world on the balance of the CO2 emission, we should invest in renewable, and we should develop take benefit of the delay of the countries who have no access to drinking water, no sanitation, no building, no infrastructure, no roads, and invest in low carbon infrastructure and technology. Of course, I completely agree with you. Invest in renewable energy, because energy, it's not only electricity, it's security, it's light. And light is security. And I used to say always, we cannot fight darkness in dark. So we need, if we want to fight against insecurity, we should light Africa. And this is why this Climate Justice Committee will deliver international. Second point, biodiversity. Of course, I was always, I'm biologist. My first degree was in biology, and I'm always astonished to see how much people are surprised to see that we have new diseases, that we have that biodiversity is at the risk to disappear. We are living in a period of our history where 80% of biodiversity is as the risk to disappear. And we know that ecosystem is made up of a living environment defined by physical characteristic, living being, and all the interactions that exist between them. So if you threaten the life of one species of the university, you are threatening all the equilibrium of all the ecosystem. So we should not be surprised to have new diseases. I always say that COVID-19 will not be the latest pandemic if we don't pay attention to biodiversity, because climate change is at the origin of waves of heat, floods, and the rise of seawater, etc., etc., all disasters which are killing species. And if you kill the species, the chain is disrupted, and if it's disrupted, the whole ecosystem is disrupted. In our, in Arabic, we have a saying, and it's very interesting. I'm wondering if it will be understandable in English. In our culture, we say, "Don't kill all the cats, otherwise you will disseminate the plague." So each species has a specific role and has a major role to play in the ecosystem. So yes, definitely the climate is threatening the biodiversity, and we should pay as much attention to biodiversity that we are paying attention to climate change fight.
Thank you, Hakima. Before I go on to another question, that's going to be mostly for Hakima. There's Doreen Haddad, who's a city councillor whom you know well. Ed has said millions of households in the UK rely on gas boilers for their heating. How do we decarbonize our household and business heating?
This is a really tough one, but the government have got to grasp it. The real challenge in the UK is that we have a very efficient gas heating system. And although we know it's no longer using as much North Sea gas, it's nevertheless manages to deliver relatively cheap heat to lots of people. And there are sort of two major ways to respond to this. Either we say, well, that was yesteryear, and we're going to deliver our heat through electricity means, which is heat pumps, ground source heat pumps, air source heat pumps, water source heat pumps, radiation, and various other methods of using electricity to create heat. Or we're going to find a replacement gas to repurpose the gas mains and our gas boilers and our gas cookers, but a gas which isn't methane, which isn't climate damaging, with the main one currently being proposed, which is hydrogen. There are some other green gases, but in terms of the volumes that we would need, if we're going to do it in real volumes, most people think it would be hydrogen. The reality is, I don't think public policymakers have decided which of those is the real option. There are real disadvantages of doing the electric route. First of all, you'll have to have a lot of power stations, renewable power stations, and possibly some gas ones that are only used once or twice a year in those really cold winter months. And so there's a huge investment for not very much. So there's a real economic issue there, particularly that you're basically kissing goodbye to all the money that's been invested in the gas network. On the other side, can we produce hydrogen or a similar gas that's not climate destroying in the volumes at a reasonable cost? And most people who's looked at hydrogen reckons we might be able to do it in 10 years' time, but it's still a might. The government has been very slow on what you really need to sort of answer these questions, which is big pilot projects and big research and development. And that's where we need to go to be able to answer that question. So one way, Doreen, I'm sort of dodging your question because we don't actually know the answer fully. However, let me try not dodge it completely. The reality is a lot of the work can be done through energy efficiency and better insulation, a lot of the work. So you don't need to heat the homes so much because they're so well insulated. That will get us a long way and is a lot cheaper, and the technologies are here and now, and we just need to push them out. And there are other technologies, ones that I wasn't very happy with the heat policies that I inherited as Secretary of State, and I developed a lot of work on heat networks, which can use things like sewage works, for example, to provide the renewable heat, which then gets distributed across a wider area. So this is an area where the government just needs to do a lot more work. It wasn't the area that we focused on most because electrification was the most important, because green electricity means you can use green electricity, and you can also use that for heating and for cars if you've got your green electricity sorted out. So it's an enabling technology. And heating is much more of a Northern Hemisphere problem as well. Doreen, that's a very long and probably rather incoherent answer to your question, but it's the government needs to get a bloody move on.
Hakima has to leave us now, but just before she does, she wants to say a few words. I have to give her a quick question, Hakima. Should we continue funding natural gas development in Africa? And if we don't, are we restricting African countries to much higher cost energy options, which either don't provide energy reliably or on a life cycle basis aren't so much better?
Oof, very difficult question, because as I told you, Africa is a very good reservoir for renewable, and it's a pity to invest on gas or to invest on coal or fossil fuel in Africa while you can invest on renewable. The problem with the problem I see for all the innovations, not only for energy, is that as far as we don't have this international coherency in the policies, it will be difficult that a country which found the gas or found the fossil fuel will forget about his production, and they are under the negotiation, those parties are asking for the right to develop because they don't have the historical responsibility of the pollution. So, and the same argument is brought by China. China is polluting now, and she is revendicating the right for development until 2030. They want to increase their emissions because they say that they were not responsible historically for the CO2 emissions. So the question is difficult, and I think that I saw what have been done in the EU, the Green Deal. That personally, I think that it's wonderful vision and strategy. I also saw the objective set by the UK, and they seems not to be so bad, even if I agree with Lord David that in terms of the decrease of the CO2 emission, we can do a lot with the energy efficiency. We can decrease by 30 to 40% the CO2 emissions. But now with the coming back of the United States, I hope that with President Joe Biden, we will have more we will be on the right trajectory because we are not. But I'm not sure that any negotiator, even the most diplomatic one, will succeed in convincing the countries who are producing oil and gas to stop because of climate change. We need to find other solutions, and we need to beat the market by the market. It's why this currency is very important. We need to make renewable less expensive. The cheapest energy we can have is already renewable. But if the regulations are set in a way that the market is developed in that way, then we can hope to have the change. Excuse me, I have to say goodbye to you. Thank you so much for inviting me. I was very delighted to participate together with you and to listen to you, dear Lord David. Thank you, Robert. And I would like only to say that this is a very crucial moment, and we are all expecting a successful COP in COP26. We have a huge hope that nations will be wise, and that the tragedies we have lived this last week will make people aware that we are not negotiating for climate change, we are negotiating for survival of people. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Hakima. Get back to your party and enjoy it. And our apologies to your husband and all your family.
No, I have guests for the Eid, and I see this opportunity to congratulate all the Muslims all over the world for the Eid. Thank you.
Thank you. Right. Right. Now I think we've taken enough pre-questions, and we've got time left to take more questions from the floor. So if somebody who would like to ask a question would put a hand up, there's a microphone over there, which I hope will reach you. Yeah, Peter. Peter is the International Officer of the Young Liberals.
Thank you very much, Robert, and thank you, Ed, for a really, really interesting talk. As Robert alluded to, I am the International Officer of Young Liberals, and therefore my question is going to be youth-themed, because over the last 3 or 4 years, people like Greta Thunberg and others have really led the way for young people making their voices heard on the climate change issue, taking to the streets of major cities all around the world. And I wonder what you think about how young people can help make COP as a really political action against climate change a successful event in the way that they have raised the issue to the public on the streets. How can they help in events like COP?
Well, first of all, thank you, Peter. I mean, I think what Greta Thunberg and the young people have done in the last few years has been fantastic. I think it has actually moved the dial. I think young people's voices are being heard in a way that they weren't before. The question, of course, though, is will that be heard in Glasgow? I'm sure there will be events, and there will be PR stunts, and there will be the usual razzmatazz. That bit, I can guarantee you that'll be heard. Well, the question is, will it make any difference? And the reality is that these negotiations, can you get the people who are dragging their heels, can you get them to move up? Because although I've got many criticisms of this government, in fact, I got a whole barrel load of criticisms, nevertheless, the UK under successive governments has not been the one dragging people backwards. And they have tended to be the oil producing nations, shock, horror. So, you've seen Russia, you've seen Venezuela, you've seen Brazil, you've seen the Saudis. They've always been the ones sort of working the rooms, working the conference centers to try to persuade people not to sign up and not to be so ambitious. And so my advice to anyone, young people or anyone else, is there any way one can get behind the political strategies that are needed to put pressure on the countries that are the laggards, the countries that are the obstacles. Now, what we tend to do is go around those and ignore them if we have to, because if they'd had their way, we wouldn't have got where we are today. But I think it's always important to direct the energy and enthusiasm of the young, not necessarily onto those governments that will sign up, right? They'll sign up, but those governments and those countries that won't, and to make, as a Liberal International, contact with young people in those countries where they could put pressure on their governments. Now, sometimes, of course, they don't have the freedom and democracy that we do in those particular countries, but where they do and where they have that and where they're able to exercise power, helping those young people get their voice heard, I think is probably the most potent way of doing it.
Another question back. Irina, I can see over there. London MEP, former London MEP.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you very much, Ed. You talked about climate change and social justice. What you haven't mentioned is climate change and human rights. And as things are, some of those people that are most important at COP26, China, India, Indonesia, to a lesser degree, Russia, also have a terrible human rights record. How do we manage to get them on board without having to sacrifice or go back on our red lines in terms of human rights?
It's a good point. I thought you were going to talk about the human rights of people who are affected by climate change directly. So I'm going to deal with that if I may, because it's a bit of an easier question to deal with. And then I'll deal with your more difficult question. Because there is an issue, because I have been in discussions and negotiations on the human rights of people who are seriously affected by climate change, and from the indigenous peoples of the forests to the poorest people on the low level land. You know, Bangladesh is the obvious example, but there are many others where effectively climate change is attacking their human rights. And I think human rights in that context ought to be a stimulus for more ambition and to get people to move further and faster. Dealing with China, say, on human rights, I mean, of course, we need to stand up for the human rights, whether it's the Uyghurs or Hong Kong Chinese or whatever. We absolutely must. The question is, do you do it at these negotiations? And it's not on the agenda at these negotiations, but I tell you, it's in the minds of the Chinese. I was at a meeting with a number of British parliamentarians and stakeholders and think tanks with the Chinese delegation on Zoom last week, I think it was. And in the open mic session, there was a lot of criticism from the Chinese side about our focus on human rights, particularly in relation to the Uyghurs. At no time did we give any ground on that, but we talked about the need for China, for its own people and their rights and their welfare, to focus on climate change. So, I mean, you could argue, and I'm not, you could argue that unless China changes its position on human rights, we won't negotiate on climate change. But it's not a position I would recommend. Climate change is an existential threat to the human race. We have to negotiate about it. There'll be no human rights to protect if we don't deal with climate change. But I do not recommend either that we muffle our voice in other fora on human rights. And I would particularly link that to trade more than climate change negotiations.
Any more questions? To take one last question.
Good evening, and thank you very much. My name is Jennifer Schomburg. I'm a member of the National Liberal Club. I also work in Islamic finance, and you called on private finance to be mobilized for technology. I'm currently working on with stakeholder group trying to prepare the ethical finance community, particularly the Islamic finance community, to prepare for COP. What your advice, what we're feeling, there's been large issuance of sustainability sukuk and green sukuk, and there's been great sovereign activity, and there's been great private activity. But as we're coming into COP, we're noticing that we're just having those who are they're very proud of what they've achieved, and they don't necessarily want to collaborate on the private finance side or on the sovereign side. And how do you recommend just getting people to put aside for just a few months their own initiatives and realize that if we don't work together, there's not, as you mentioned, if we don't deal with climate change, we're not going to have human rights to protect. The planet will survive. It's we as a species that won't. And how do we really drum that across to get everybody to just focus together? And then we can go on to our own personal agendas tomorrow, especially in the private finance world where we are competing together.
I think it's a great question. If I've understood the direction of the travel behind it, there are lots of organizations, EU, individual countries who are developing frameworks for discussing climate change. There's the taxonomy debate. Now, the taxonomy debate, for those who haven't followed it in detail, I don't want you to think I'm an expert on it because I'm not, but the taxonomy debate is about how you judge whether an investment is climate friendly or not. So how you measure the climate impact of a particular process, a particular product, and so on. And because we need to know, investors need to know, shareholders need to know, governments need to know, citizens need to know whether or not corporates and financial sector are going green, or is it just greenwash? And to do that, you need standards. Yeah. And you need to be able to say, well, this is climate friendly and this isn't climate friendly. And so that whole taxonomy debate is trying to think through, it's an intellectual exercise, how you do that. And different countries and different organizations have reached different conclusions. And as you say, they're very proud. We've got this, and actually they need to get over it, right? And we need some global standards. Now, maybe we don't need global standards tomorrow, but ideally we will move towards more common currency on this, because that will help the flow of capital. It will help those markets. It will help players. If there are too many standards and too many taxonomies, then we're in trouble. That's a good example, a really good example. I think it's across the whole financial sector, frankly. We need to create this analytical framework, if you like. We need disclosures, we need reporting, we need people to be able to understand the data that's coming out of this. And although this is not new, it's been going for some time, it's still, I think, a relatively new science or framework, if you like. We just need people to come together. It needs to be, even in this early days, we need to make it mandatory. There's a huge debate about whether it should stay voluntary. I think on big corporates and big financial institutions, this has got to be mandatory. It's mandatory disclosure. I mean, we're in an emergency. We can't allow people just to hide behind the PR flim-flam. So I'm more for mandatory disclosure, and you may think that's illiberal. I don't. I think it's about the survival of the human race, so get a bloody move on. But I'd actually go further than that, and you might think this is illiberal. It isn't. We've got to, and I'm not sure where the debate is in your sphere on this, and I don't see the debate even under the Carney initiatives on accountancy and audit. Now, I'm not an accountant. I don't do audit. I think the people who do are wonderful people. I was the minister actually briefly for accountancy and audit for a year and a half. And what you notice on that is how critical accountants and auditors are to the functioning of our economy. Because people need to know where their money has gone, how it's been used, and the government needs to sort of check and others. So that checking and auditing is a fundamental part of frankly, the rule of law of capitalism. And if we're going to green capitalism, we're going to decarbonize capitalism as we must, we're going to need, yes, this disclosure we talked about, the reporting, the standards, but we're going to need some sticks. And that's only going to come through if this type of measure is built into accountancy. So your average accountant and your average auditor becomes the green warrior of the future. And your average accountant is saying, you're not on your transition to net zero. You're way off it. You're going to be carbon insolvent. And you may be a going concern financially, but you're not a going concern in terms of the climate. You've got to close down. That's how tough we're going to get. We're going to have to build in the model that we have in the financial world. We have to build it in the climate finance world. And so my concern at the moment is no one's being anywhere near radical enough. Yes, let's get the disclosures. Let's get the reporting. Let's get the frameworks. But you've got to come onto that to where we've been in the financial world for frankly centuries. And I don't see that debate there. I don't see it in the run up to Glasgow.
Thank you, Ed. I'll pass the mic to Emma.
Hello, everybody. I'm Emma Moore. I'm the chair of the Sustainability Forum, and I just want to say thank you very, very much to Ed in particular and Hakima, the Paddy Ashdown Forum, and you all for coming. We really, really appreciate it. I'd also like to thank our committee because it was a huge amount of work to get this here today, and I can't thank everybody enough. Now, I just want to reflect on some of the comments that have been said. So thank you, Ed. It's unusual to be in a room, I think, where there's so much knowledge and passion and care from politicians about this. So I just want to say thank you very much, because I think this was really, I guess, heartening for everybody here to really think that, yes, we do know what's going on and yes, we can help with it. So I think that's really brilliant. So thank you very much. I would also like to say, I know everyone has been sitting down for a solid hour and a half and would probably quite like a drink. I also know people have been messaging me and saying that they didn't quite get to ask the question that they would like to ask. So there is networking here until 8 p.m. So if you would like to mix around, I will be introducing some people as well, because I can spot people who should know each other. And I do know most of the people in the room. And I also want to talk about cross-party stuff. So we do have people from all different parties here, which I really value. And it shows that we've got all different sides of the sustainability debate here today, which is hugely important. So if you'd like to contribute to the forum or speak, please let me know. We have Carlotta here who is recording and should wave. She is One Young World's coordinating ambassador for the UK. She is our next speaker. She is speaking on the 5th of August about how to invest sustainably. Carlotta speaks 8 different languages and works across multiple banking systems. So if you do have any questions, please come and see her. She is brilliant. We also have Carolyn Lucas coming up. Talking about climate. We're also working with the Defence Forum. So we've got Noel at the back, who's the chair, talking about how security and climate very much go hand in hand. So without further ado, I'll let you have some drinks. And Lord Chidgey's also snuck in, who did the welcome at the start. So if everyone wants to socialise, that'd be terrific. And I just want to say thank you again so much, everybody. And if we could grab a photo, that would be fabulous.
Martini. Just to first up, he is forward. I used to photograph horses. Hi, Dennis.
Oh, yeah, Lord.
How are you?
Well, yeah, people all been up hearing you twice in one day. How are you?
I'm well, good, yeah.
Brilliant, brilliant.
Martini again, I think.